The salt flats of Orum had no mercy in them. They stretched to the horizon in every direction. 3 moons hung in slow processions overhead, their pale light doing nothing to soften the wind that came screaming off the glacial shelf to the north. Kyphra stood at the front of the 4 of them because that was what she'd always done. Habit, she supposed, was the last dignity a discarded thing could hold on to. Behind her, Khoren had wrapped both arms around herself, her bioluminescent skin dimmed almost to nothing in the cold. The faint pearl light that had once made nobles stop mid-sentence, now flickering like a candle in a draught. And Solina, youngest, smallest, most recently broken, stood at the rear, with her eyes fixed on nothing, or perhaps on something the rest of them could not see. They had been given nothing. No cloaks, no final meal. The Vaelish Enforcement Bureau was meticulous in its paperwork, and contemptuous of comfort, because the Archon-King's degenerative condition was a state secret, even from the Bureau. The transport manifest had listed them under a single category: biologically void, scheduled for environmental erasure. Not execution, not termination, erasure, as though the goal were to make it sound like housekeeping. 2 Bureau officers stood a careful distance away, their white uniforms immaculate, their expressions the polished blank of bureaucrats who had decided long ago that feelings were inefficiencies. One held a scanner. The other held a datapad on which, Kyphra knew, their death certificates were already signed, time-stamped, and filed with the Union's central registry. They were, in the eyes of every law that governed the civilized galaxy, already gone. The officer with the datapad glanced at his timepiece. "Erasure window opens in 4 standard minutes," he announced. To no one in particular. The salt flats would do the rest. Orum storms were reliable. The Bureau had studied them. Kyphra heard the shuttle before she saw it. It was not a sleek craft, and it touched down 50 meters from the Bureau officers, with a thud that sent salt crystals skittering across the flat. The door opened. Steam vented. A figure dropped to the ground. He was not tall. By Vaelish standards, he was almost comically compact, broad through the chest and shoulder in a way that looked structurally wrong for a biped. His hands large, his boots leaving deep prints in the salt crust, where theirs had barely marked it. He wore a heavy coat, the color of old rust, and he was already reading from a physical document as he walked, which was the strangest thing Kyphra had seen in months. And she had just been shipped to a moon to die. "Stop," he said. He said it the way a support beam holds weight. Quietly, completely, with no interest in negotiation. The Bureau officer blinked. "This is a restricted eraser site. You are licensed." The man held up a laminated card without breaking stride. "Riley Vasquez. Frontier Salvage and Environmental Recovery Registration 7 Alpha Orum 09. And you?" He stopped 3 paces from the officer and held out the document. "Are in violation of Compact Article 19. Subsection 4, Clause 7C. That clause governs waste disposal near any registered frontier claim within 40 kilometers. Riley smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who had spent years reading contracts written to make people give up. My claim flag went in this morning. 41 standard hours ago, to be precise. Registered, time-stamped, and since I've already uplinked the live feed of this encounter to the neutral compact registry, confirmed by the Orum Colonial Authority. He produced a second document, then a third. I've been planning this particular morning for a while. The bureau officer's scanner hand dropped slowly to his side. Kyphra watched the man, Riley, and felt something shift in her chest that she did not have a name for. It was not hope. It was closer to the sensation of standing on a bridge and realizing mid-step that the boards were more solid than you had expected. These individuals, the officer said carefully, are classified as biological waste under Vaelish Union statute. Great. Perfect. I love that. Riley folded his documents back into a worn leather satchel. Because the Compact's definition of biological waste, which your union signed in the Third Expansion Treaty, means I can file a salvage claim on from them, the same as I would on an abandoned cargo freighter. He looked at the four of them for the first time. His eyes were dark and steady and contained something she could not catalog. They're legally dead to your union. Dead things don't fall under your jurisdiction. They fall under frontier salvage law. He looked back at the officer. Which is mine. There was a silence. Wind crossed it. You can't be serious, the second officer said. I've got 6 hours of legal precedent in this bag that says I am. You want to stand here and read it, or do you want to let me do my job? Your erasure window closes in... He checked a battered wristwatch. 90 seconds. After that, you've missed your scheduled window, and you have to file for a new one, which takes 3 weeks, minimum. I've read your bureau's procedural manual. You hate paperwork. The officer with the data pad looked at the officer with the scanner. A bureaucratic calculation happened behind their pale eyes, swift and cold. Then the man with the data pad made a notation, turned, and walked back towards their own craft without another word. His colleague followed. Riley watched them go. When their ship lifted and banked north, he let out a breath that was not quite a sigh, more the controlled release of a person who had been holding something very heavy and was choosing, carefully, to set it down. He turned back to the four of them. Right, he said. My shuttle's not pretty, but it's warm. You'll want warm. Can you walk? Kheya's chin came up. I can walk. She could not, quite. Orum's gravity was a slow cruelty, a constant pressure on every joint, and she had not been conditioned for it. None of them had. Kyphra felt it in her knees, in the base of her spine, in the way her lungs had to work slightly harder for the same air. She managed. They all managed. Because the alternative was to stand on a salt flat and wait for a storm. Riley did not offer to carry anyone. He walked at a pace they could match, and when Solina stumbled on a ridge of cracked salt, his hand was simply there, a broad, calloused hand that steadied her elbow and withdrew without comment, without performance, without the pointed kindness that would have made her feel small. Inside the shuttle, it was warm and smelled of wood smoke and something spiced. They sat on bench seats that were patched with different materials in a way that suggested function had always been chosen over appearance. The shuttle lifted. "Where are you taking us?" Kyphra asked. "My homestead. About 12 minutes south." He was already in the cockpit, his eyes on the instruments. "I've got 4 spare rooms. They need some work. You'll have to be patient." "And what do you want in return?" He was quiet for a moment. "Breakfast is usually around the 7th hour. I'll show you where everything is, and you can make your own choices from there." That was not an answer. She filed it carefully and kept watching him. The homestead sat in the fold of 2 low hills, sheltered from the worst of Orum's northern winds by the geography of the land itself, as though someone had read the planet carefully before choosing where to stay. It was not elegant. It was built from local stone and milled timber, pale wood that had been dried and sealed against the climate. Khoren stepped out of the shuttle and stopped. The sun was setting over the western hills, and Orum's sky, the sky they had seen only in transit as a bruised and hostile thing, was doing something she had not expected. The 3 moons were rising in sequence, each catching the sun's last light differently. The large inner moon a deep copper, the second a pale rose, the third still silver on the night, dark side of its arc. The salt flats to the north caught it all and threw it back. The hills went amber. The frost cloth over the garden glowed. She stood there until Kheya walked into her from behind, stumbled, caught herself on the doorframe with a hiss of frustration. "The gravity," Kheya said to no one and everyone. It came out harder than she intended. "It layers on you," Riley said. He had already opened the main door and was holding it. "First few days you'll feel it in your hips and lower back. After a week, your body starts to adapt. After a month, you'll barely notice." He paused. "There are resistance bands inside if you want to work with it instead of against it. Kheya, right?" She looked at him sharply. He had used her name. Not her title. Her name. Without prefix or ceremony. The way you might say the name of a piece of furniture you were fond of. "Yes," she said, after a beat. He nodded and went inside. They followed. The interior was one open main room, with a hearth at the far end that was already lit, the fire established and settled. Heavy rugs on the stone floor, a long table of the same pale wood as the exterior, worn smooth at the edges. Shelves along one wall lined with physical books, hundreds of them. A sight so archaic it made Kyphra's analytical mind scramble, briefly for context. And along another wall, tools. Hand tools, most of them, for woodworking and repair and gardening, arranged with the quiet organization of someone who used them regularly. The 4 corridors of the main room led to 4 small chambers. Each had a bed, a blanket chest, a washstand. Each had a window, They were not palatial. They were clean and solid. And after a transport hold in a salt flat, they were the most welcome rooms Kyphra had ever stood in. She did not say that. She stood in her doorway and ran a hand along the window frame and catalogued the workmanship and felt, very quietly, the particular exhaustion of a person who has been braced for death and has not died. In the main room, she could hear Riley building the fire. He cooked without ceremony. That was the first thing that confused them. There was no ceremony to it. No invocation of hospitality, no formal statement of welcome or obligation, no ritual framework with which the meal could be understood as transactional. He moved from the hearth to the wide kitchen counter and back again, with the easy efficiency of someone performing a task he had done many times and did not need to think about very hard. And the smells that filled the main room were rich and foreign and complicated. Kheya appeared first, drawn by something she would later refuse to identify as hunger, and certainly not as curiosity. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched. "Protein from the root stores," Riley said, without turning. He was cutting something with the methodical patience of a surgeon. "Quarum's too cold for most livestock. I do keep birds. You'll hear them in the morning. But tonight is just vegetables and dried goods." He paused. "Are there things you can't eat? Allergies, restrictions?" "Vaelish physiology is compatible with most carbon-based foods," Kheya said. "That's good to know in a scientific sense. I was asking if there's anything you don't like." She had never been asked that. The jewels of the Union ate what was presented. Preference was considered an indulgence. "I don't know," she said. And it came out more honest than she intended. "Then we'll find out," he said simply. Solina drifted in next, drawn to the warmth of the fire more than to any particular appetite. She sat on one of the long benches at the table and folded her hands on the worn wood and stared at them. Khoren came last, still slightly dazed from the sunset, and took a seat beside her. Kyphra sat across from them, spine straight, watching Riley plate 4 portions and carry them to the table. He set one before each of them, and then filled a 5th for himself, and sat at the end of the table, without fanfare. "There's water in the jug. Salt on the shelf if you want it." Kyphra looked at her portion, then at him. "And what do you want from us in exchange for this?" Riley looked up from his own plate. He was quiet for a moment. "Nothing," he said. "You're here. You eat." "That is not a functional arrangement. We need to understand our obligations. What is our work schedule? What do we owe for the lodging, the legal intervention?" "I didn't spring you off that salt flat because I needed labor," he said. His voice had not changed in volume or tone, but something in it had settled. The way a large animal is still without being passive. "I did it because it was wrong." "What was happening to you?" was wrong. He cut a piece of the root vegetable on his plate. You don't owe me for a person choosing not to let a wrong thing happen. Solina made a small sound that was not quite a word. He looked at her, briefly. The same steadiness in his eyes. Eat, he said gently. It's just supper. On the fourth night, it rained. Orum's rain was not a gentle thing. It came in sideways off the glacial shelf, loaded with particulate and electric with the planet's particular atmospheric chemistry, drumming against the storm glass and the wide-eaved roof, with a sound like a sustained argument. Inside, the fire was built high. Riley had gone to bed early, after a long day of winter-proofing the eastern wall, and the four of them sat around the hearth in the particular quiet of people who have stopped performing normalcy for the day. It was Kheya who spoke first. She had been staring at her own hands. The hands of a military strategist, trained in weapons and tactics, and finding them useless in ways she could not compartmentalize away. We should discuss what we are now, she said. What we have become. What we've always been, Kyphra said. Just without the architecture that made it meaningful. We were never the architecture, Khoren said softly. She was watching the fire. We were what was inside it. She paused. I think. I'm not certain anymore. Solina pulled her knee to her chest. I failed the rite. We all did. Whatever we were built to be, we couldn't even do that. Her voice was flat, with the particular flatness of an emotion that has been felt so many times it has worn a groove. The Union was right to... It wasn't right, said a voice from the doorway. Riley stood there in a heavy sleep shirt and his boots, which he had clearly put back on mid-trip through the hall. He did not apologize for overhearing. He looked at Solina for a moment, then walked to the chair by the hearth, the one that was clearly his, worn to the shape of him, and sat down. The rite tests one biological function, he said. It doesn't test what you are. In the Union, Kyphra began. I know what the Union says. I spent 11 years arguing with it professionally. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. Back on Earth, where I'm from, we have this idea. Found family. It means the people you choose. Not the people assigned to your bloodline. Not the people whose genes are compatible with yours. The people you decide matter to you. He glanced around at them. We also have something called a hobby. Kheya frowned. A hobby. Something you do not because it produces anything, or proves anything, or advances your position. You do it because it's worth doing in itself. Because you like it. He stretched out his long legs towards the fire. I grow things out there, in that garden, not because Orum needs a garden strategically. I cook because I like eating good food. I have every one of those books because I like reading them. He paused. Nobody's utility is the sum of them. Not yours. Not mine. They sat with that for a while. The rain continued its argument with the roof. That sounds, Kyphra said finally, very precisely, like The kind of thing a person says when they want you to stop being afraid of them.
It is,
Riley agreed.
Doesn't mean it isn't also true.
The scout ship landed on the 9th day. They heard it before they saw it. A sound entirely unlike Riley's battered shuttle. A clean and authoritative transit signature that pressed down on the homestead like a thumb. Kheya, who had been in the garden attempting to relearn the mechanics of her own body in Orum's gravity, was on her feet and moving for the door before the ship had finished its descent. Old instinct. You move toward the threat, or you are always at its mercy. Riley was already outside. He stood on the flat ground before the homestead's main entrance, with his arms folded and his weight balanced, and his expression entirely composed. He watched the ship settle. He watched the boarding ramp descend. He watched the Vaelish officers in the deep navy dress uniform of the Archonate step out onto Orum's salt-crusted soil. And he did not move. The lead officer was thin, even by Vaelish standards, his bioluminescence carrying a faintly blue hue that marked the Arconate's inner circle. He introduced himself without his title, which was its own category of threat.
You are the human who filed a salvage claim, Vaelish said.
It was not a question.
I am,
Riley said.
The claim is invalid. The biological material you are harboring, the women,
Riley said pleasantly. The biological material is required by the Arcanate for a medical procedure of significant urgency. Vaelish clasped his hands behind his back. The Arcaning is suffering from a degenerative ossal condition. The subject's rare bone marrow profile, a result of their dual lineage modification, is the only compatible treatment available. His gaze moved past Riley to the 4 women in the doorway. They will be collected. You will be compensated fairly for your transportation costs. Kyphra felt the air change. It was not fear, exactly. She had already been sent to die. This was the second version of the same calculation. We have found another use for you, so we will use it up.
They're dead,
Riley said. Vaelish looked back at him. I beg your pardon. Under Vaelish Union law, which your Arcanate ratified in full, these 4 individuals were declared biologically void and erased from the civil registry. They are legally deceased. His voice carried the same quiet weight as always.
You cannot harvest the bone marrow of living people without consent. But you also cannot harvest the bone marrow of dead people at all, because dead people fall under the Compact's protection of salvaged biological remains, which prohibits medical extraction without the express agreement of the salvager of record. He let that land. That's me.
Vaelish studied him. You are one human. On a frontier moon.
I am, Riley agreed. And you're an Arcanate fleet officer who doesn't want the Compact Tribunal to spend the next decade litigating why you tried to extract bone marrow from legally dead salvage on a registered frontier claim. He smiled. It would be an extraordinary amount of paperwork.
Vaelish withdrew the scout ship to a holding orbit and gave Riley 12 hours to reconsider. It was A negotiating move. Riley knew it, and the way he explained it to them, calmly, standing at the kitchen counter making tea, made it clear he had encountered the move before. "He'll come back with more ships," Kheya said. She was standing, which she did now with considerably less effort than she had on day one. Her body was adapting. She did not take pleasure in that fact as so much as file it. "He'll come back with enough force to make the legal argument academic." "Yes," Riley said. "That's what I do." "Then what do you intend to do about it?" He poured 2 mugs and slid one toward her. "I intend to use the planet." The plan, as he explained it over the next 2 hours, was characteristically understated in tone and unexpectedly layered in substance. Orum's environment was not an obstacle, Riley explained. It was a feature. The northern glacial shelf generated electromagnetic interference that disrupted precision targeting systems. The salt flats' albedo at dawn was blinding without appropriate filtration, and Vaelish environmental suits were designed for controlled atmospheres, not raw frontier conditions. The homestead's construction, stone, timber, deep-set foundations, was essentially immune to the directed energy weapons on a Scout-class vessel. "And the storm system," Kheya said, looking at the forecast screen. "Due in 36 hours. Category 4. Their hull shielding will hold, but their boarding equipment won't function in these winds." He looked at the map. "If we can stretch their timeline past that window, any ground assault becomes physically impossible for at least 72 hours. Kyphra had been listening from the table. "You've considered all of this before today." He glanced at her. "I consider contingencies. It's a habit. From my time as a person who pays attention." He turned back to the map. "I need to know what you can do. Each of you." It was the first time he had asked. Not what they were worth. Not what their biological profile contained. Not what they had once been. What they could do. Kheya straightened to her full height. Orum's gravity pulled at her as it always did. She had been working against it for 9 days now. And she was beginning to understand the terms of the argument. She had spent her life as a strategist. She began to speak, and Riley listened, without interrupting. And when she finished, he nodded once, in the particular way that meant he had understood, and was already building on it. Khoren moved without being asked to the eastern window, which had the widest sightline, and began to sketch the appropriate terrain from memory on a piece of paper with one of Riley's spare pencils. Her hand was precise. It had always been precise. Solina looked at the storm forecast and said quietly, "I know the resonance frequency of Vaelish suit seals. They vibrate in high wind conditions at a specific pitch." She paused. "I spent 3 years composing pieces for military ceremonies. The acoustic modeling. I know what breaks their equipment." She looked at Riley. "Can you build something that produces that frequency?" He looked at her for a moment, and the expression on his face was not surprise, exactly. It was the expression of someone who had suspected the room was larger than it appeared, and had just found another wall. "Yes," he said. "Walk me through it." The Vaelish returned with 3 ships. They came in at dawn, when Orum's albedo was at its most punishing, and the brightness of the salt flat reached them before their targeting systems had fully adjusted. The homestead stone and timber bulk absorbed the initial ranging shots without structure damage, scoring the exterior, cracking 2 shutters, leaving long black marks along the eastern wall. Riley was already outside, moving low and fast between outbuildings, and the way he moved in Orm's gravity, the heavy, grounded lope of a body built for this planet in a way that Vaelish bodies simply were not, was its own education in the difference between a species shaped by safety and a species shaped by necessity. Kheya coordinated from the interior, her voice steady, her commands precise. She had mapped the approach, vectors during the planning session, and she called them now as they materialized. A field officer doing what she had trained her whole life to do. Adapted for a theater she could never have predicted. Solina's acoustic device, a collaboration between her frequency knowledge and Riley's mechanical capability, assembled overnight from parts of the shuttle's secondary systems. Activated when the first boarding system descended from the lead ship. The frequency was below hearing. A deep, structural vibration that targeted the resident seam of Vaelish environmental suit seals. 2 of the boarding officers' suits began to fail within moments. The flexible seal material deforming in the high-altitude chill. They retreated. The second wave was better equipped. They reached the homestead's outer perimeter, which was where they found the ground. An apparently flat expanse of salt crust had been prepared. Riley had spent the previous afternoon determining which sections of crust were solid and which bridged natural hollows. The boarding team discovered this from the inside. The third wave did not come. What came instead was Vaelish himself, on foot, without weapons, walking towards the homestead's main door with his hands visible. Riley came to meet him. He was dusty, and there was a burn mark along one sleeve of his coat, and he was breathing evenly. The controlled, unhurried breath of a man who had run hard and is not willing to show it. He stopped 10 meters from Vaelish in the flat morning light, with his feet slightly apart and his hands loose at his sides. Kyphra watched from the doorway. She had seen many things in her life that she had understood in the moment as significant. The political theater of the Vaelish court was full of significance, or had been, before she became inconvenient. But she had never seen anything quite like this. One human, standing on an alien moon, in a coat with a burned sleeve, waiting, with complete composure, for an Arcanet officer to say something that justified the kind of morning they'd just had. Vaelish looked at him for a long time. "You are extraordinarily difficult," he said. "I try to be," Riley said. Riley brought Vaelish inside. Kyphra understood immediately that this was tactical. You did not bring an enemy into your home out of hospitality. You brought them in to control the environment, to sit them at a table you had chosen, in a chair that was lower than yours, with the fire behind you, and the light in their eyes. He gave Vaelish tea. The Archon looked as though it might do something. "You've made your point," Vaelish said. "I've made several," Riley agreed, sitting across from him. "But I want to be sure we're clear on the most important one." He folded his hands on the table.
You came here to extract bone marrow from 4 women without their consent, using the legal fiction that they're dead to justify the procedure. The fact that your Arkan King needs medical treatment is not their problem and not their obligation.
Without the procedure, he will not survive the year.
I'm aware.
Riley's voice was even.
I'm also aware that the Compact Tribunal has a formal grievance process for medical emergencies that affect ruling governance under Article 44. You've not filed it. Do you know why you haven't filed it?
A pause. Something moved behind Valeris's pale eyes.
Because, Riley continued, filing it would require you to disclose that the Arkan King's condition is a consequence of the modified bone marrow program that produced the jewel line in the first place. A program that the Compact was never formally notified about. Genetic modification of noble bloodlines for specific biological outputs. That's a Category 2 compliance violation. He tilted his head. I spent 11 years doing contract law. I read the classified annexes. I found them interesting.
The silence extended.
What?
Vaelish said carefully. Do you want?
3 things.
Riley raised a finger.
First, formal documents. Today, signed by the Arcanate and registered with the Compact Tribunal. Legally reinstating all 4 of these women as living persons. With full civil rights, no union affiliation required.
Another finger.
Second, a standing non-interference covenant for this homestead and the 40-kilometer claim zone. Permanent, non-revocable.
The third finger.
And third, the Arkan King pursues legitimate medical channels through the Compact's emergency provision, which means the Arcanate has to admit what they did with the Jewel program. But that's a problem you created, not them.
Vaelish looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the 4 women in the room. Kyphra standing. Kheya leaning against the wall, with her arms folded. Khoren by the window. Solina at the far end of the table, with her hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold. And if I decline, he said.
Then I file the disclosure myself,
Riley said pleasantly.
I have everything I need.
It was not a bluff. Kyphra could see from the way Vaelish processed it that he could see that too. The documents were signed by midday. 2 days after Vaelish lifted for orbit, the storm arrived. It came as promised. Category 4, screaming off the glacial shelf with everything Orum had, and the homestead held. The stone walls did not shake. The deep-set foundations did not shift. The wide-eaved roof shed the driven ice and particulate without complaint. Inside, the fire burned high, and the windows ran with condensation, and the 5 of them listened to the planet rage outside, and were, collectively, warm. Khoren sat at the table with paper and charcoal, and sketched the frost patterns on the storm glass. The patterns were not decorative. They were structural, the physical record of a temperature differential. But they were also unambiguously beautiful. And she had decided that those two things were not in conflict on Oram, even if they had been in the Union. Kheya had taken over a section of the main room's wall space for her tactical maps, and was engaged in what Riley had come to recognize as her version of contentment. Reorganizing information she already knew into more efficient forms. She had begun, in the last few days, to teach him the Vaelish military notation system. He was a faster learner than she had anticipated, which annoyed and pleased her in equal measure. Kyphra read. She read with the voracity of someone making up for time spent in rooms where the books were decorative. Riley's shelves were disorganized, in the way of a person who arranged his library by emotional association, rather than taxonomy, and she found this baffling, and also privately charming. She had begun leaving notes in the margins of things she disagreed with. He had begun responding to them. It was the most honest conversation she had had in years. Solina was in the kitchen. She had discovered in the slow weeks of the homestead that cooking was a form of composition, that the sequencing of flavors was structurally similar to the sequencing of sound, that timing was everything, that restraint and excess were both choices with consequences. She was not yet skilled. She was determined, which Riley had said was more durable than skill, and also more interesting to watch. He came and stood in the kitchen doorway while she worked, as he often did, and she did not mind. He watched her the way you watch a fire. Not to assess it, but because it was there, and because it was alive. The legal documents came through on the uplink, he said. All four. Official compact registration. He paused, searching for the precise word. Yourselves now. Officially. She did not look up from the pan. We were always ourselves. I know, he said, but now the paperwork agrees. Outside, the storm found the limits of its fury and began very slowly to let go. By evening, when the clouds broke in the west, all three moons were rising in sequence. Copper, rose, silver. Khoren went to the door and opened it and stood in the cold air and looked at the sky. And the others drifted out, one by one. Kyphra, with her book still open. Kheya, with her arms folded against the chill. Solina, wiping her hands on a cloth. And they stood on the threshold of a homestead that was not a palace or a prison or a transport hold or a salt flat awaiting erasure. And they watched the moons. Riley stood behind them. His hands were in his pockets, and he was not looking at the moons. He was looking at them. The four of them. The particular shape they made, standing together in the doorway of his home. Their bioluminescent skin catching the copper light. Their silk-like hair moving in the last of the storm's breath. And he was doing what humans do with things they love. Memorizing it. Against the future. Against forgetting. He did not say anything. He did not need to. In the Union's registry, they were reinstatements. Living persons. Rights restored. Affiliation? None. On Oram, They were something simpler and considerably less provisional. They were home,